Here we're on the lanes with Brian, and we're going to kind of go over how to find your PAP and the relevance of PAP. Brian, can you explain what the PAP is?
Sure. Well, PAP stands for positive axis point. And if you think of any round object in motion, when it's spinning, it's going to have an axle basically that's rotating. Everything's rotating around that spot. So in terms of the bowling ball, we're going to find the one, if we're right-handed, on the right-hand side of the ball. If we're left-handed, on the left-hand side of the ball. Now there's a spot on the complete opposite side of the ball that's also going to be what you would consider an axis point. But because when we throw the ball we can't see it, it's not important in relationship to bowling.
So we call it positive axis point. It's the one we can see. The opposite side would be called the negative axis point. And again, with the fingers up, for a right-handed bowler, it's going to be on your right side. Left-hand bowler is going to be a left side. It's going to be unique to every bowler, but finding your positive axis point, a lot of people have trouble with that, how to do it. So we're going to give a quick demonstration how easy it actually is to find your positive axis point. To find your positive axis point, you need to actually throw the ball on the lane, and we have Brian throw a shot for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to get our oil lines. You're going to have multiple oil lines here. What we're looking for is the one that's actually closest to the fingers and closest to the thumb. And we want to kind of follow that oil line as it covers around our grip. Now, if you have what we call an armadillo, it makes it a lot easier. What was the use of the armadillo, Brian?
Well, it already has what we call tilt measurements on it, where the different lines and the angles of the line, depending on the angle of the track on the bowling ball. So the more up and down, we use one of the lines that are closer to the center. The more sort of angled, more of a spinner type roll, they're going to be the lines who are more angled or around the side of the ball.
Because you're not covering the full circumference of the bowling ball when you throw it. Everyone has some kind of tilt, so their tracks are going to be different sizes.
Exactly. So what we want to do is once we have this line that Rod made here, the closest to the fingers and the closest to the thumb, we want to just find what line matches up perfectly on the armadillo with that wax pencil line that we just made. So in my case, it's the 3-degree line, or the first line over from the center. So we simply get that spot lined up with that wax pencil line, and then we're going to come over here to the side, mark a little spot on the side of the ball, and then Rod will just put a little piece of tape right there.
And again, this is just white vinyl tape. You can get it at your local hardware store, a little bit of square. It won't leave a residue on the lanes. It will not leave a residue in the ball return, and it's very easy to see it go down the lane. So this is your positive axis point, and everyone has a unique positive axis point. But what if you don't have this armadillo? I mean, these are nice, but not everyone has access to them. Another thing you can do is if you draw your line, what Brian drew right here, and what you want to do is you want to turn it so that it actually is parallel with the tabletop, like so, from both directions. And if you do that from both directions, parallel this way, it's going to be the North Pole. And that's going to be an easy way to find your positive axis point without an armadillo. To be able to check it, you go out there and throw a shot. We just want to make sure that it's solid right off the hand.
Yeah, and generally, because the bowler's view, we're not going to pick up the ball till about 3 or 4 feet on the lane. It's good to be able to have somebody like a friend sit back there and really check to see if that spot is on the mark.
Especially coming off your hand, because as you see, we've lost them, but you had multiple oil lines here. So that's every revolution that ball goes down the lane, that axle is actually changing on that bowling ball. So this is just the initial right off your hand on your release. The reason we use positive axis point is get the initial release profile for every player. This is important because every player has their own unique release profile, which takes into account the player's tilt, axis rotation, their ball speed, as well as their RPMs. We've already seen our high rev player, Brian, but let's break down what we're looking for with his initial PAP. Look at the spot we marked that stays solid for the first several feet as the ball is released onto the lane. As you can see, as we add our tilt rotation grid, Brian has very low tilt. He's only about 3 degrees of tilt, and his axis rotation is approximately 65 degrees. Generally, lower tilt will read the lane sooner than higher tilt, and his 65 degrees of rotation is a minimum number that enables him to see good backhand reaction. Now let's take a look at a couple other styles to better understand individual release profiles and how it affects the ball motion. Our next player is Teresa. Teresa has quite a bit more tilt than Brian at release, and has about 17 degrees of tilt. She has also about 72 degrees of rotation. That means the ball will have a longer skid phase, and since she's throwing it with less speed and less RPMs, this enables the ball to get down the lane and still have some energy at the pins. Now let's take a look at our next player, Steven. He's right in between the 2 previous releases, with about 10 degrees of tilt, and he's using around 70 degrees of rotation. 10 degrees is still considered a low tilt, which means the ball will want to enter the hook phase a little bit earlier than higher tilts. And with 7 degrees of rotation, this will get him down the lane and still have a good backhand potential with a normal release. Okay, Brian has just thrown another shot, and we've had the positive axis point for his initial track, but you'll notice here we have multiple oil lines. This is as the ball is going down the lane. So we want to find a axis point for the mid lane or in the hook phase of the bowling ball. So we want to kind of, same way we did for the positive axis points, kind of look for the last oil line, second last oil line, depending on how the taper, how much oil's out there, and we want to do the same thing. So you want to go ahead and show them how to find that again?
Sure, so once again, much like we did with the initial PAP, we're going to just try and match up which line matches that last oil ring, or maybe the second to last oil ring on the bowling ball. So it's very similar. We just look at the angle, and we already know which one matched up before in terms of how far off of that center line. So we want to use that same amount of tilt, so to speak, to get that second line.
So you already knew that you already had 3 degrees, so generally that's going to stay the same at least through this phase of ball motion. So you already know what line to match up with.
Exactly, so that makes it a little bit easier. So once we just want to set the armadillo on it again, match up whatever line matches that wax pencil line. Come over here, draw another little dot with the wax pencil, and we'll let Rod put that spot right on there again.
And if you have different color tape, we usually recommend doing a different color for the second piece of tape. It's going to make it easier to pick up as it goes down the lane. Now again, if you don't have an armadillo, you can still do it the same, the old-fashioned way. Again, fingers and thumb above the line you drew, parallel with the tabletop this way, parallel with the tabletop this way, and it's going to be the point at the tallest, or the North Pole on the bowling ball.
So Rod, the most important thing, I guess the most important reason to find this would be so that we know how much the ball's hooking, or how much, what are we marking this for?
This one's going to give us an idea how much the ball is actually flared in the front part of the lane. It's gone from the skid phase, it's in the hook phase, it's in the hook phase going down the lane, trying to get to the roll phase. So it's giving us how much the ball is migrating on the first 30, 35 feet of lane. So that was our higher rev player, Brian. Now let's look at other styles, starting with Teresa, who plays the lanes much straighter. Again, you want to watch the spot where the ball exits the oil pattern further down the lane, and you'll see how the yellow tape becomes solid. It happens fast, but that tells us how much the ball has flared in the oily part of the lane as it exits the pattern. And now our next player, or tweener player, Steven. Again, we're watching for that quick spot coming off the oil where the yellow tape is solid. That's a mid-lane PAP. And these are pretty close for our 3 players, but you'll see some big differences when we get to the back end. Now we looked at some bowlers, and we've been looking at mid-lane PAP, the migration they had. And now we need to find the last one, which is going to be for the roll phase going into the pins. This is the hardest one for a bowler to find, isn't it, Brian?
For sure, because we're really talking about when the ball is flaring, but on the no oil part of the lane.
The dry part of the lane.
So it's really hard to see. You're not going to see a big oil ring or anything like that. But what we want to look for is those same type of flare rings.
We hit this with 1,000 just so we can actually have something to be able to see. You can see the multiple lines, and that's friction lines from the back end of the lane. That's not actually oil lines. So you're looking for the last one for the player coming across as it moves. So again, you want to identify it just like you did on the oil line.
Yeah, so very similar with the oil lines, except this is just the dry part of the lane. We just want to draw a line down where we see that last oil ring. So similar to that. And then the only difference with the armadillo this time, as opposed to using it the right side up, I guess you could say, we want to flip it upside down, because we're going to come back, because the ball is always going to migrate closer to towards the center of our grip. So we want to flip this upside down, use that same amount of tilt to try and get a reference point. And then we're going to come back on the other side of the ball. As you can see, that last or final PAP mark is a lot closer to the center of the grip, and it's migrated quite a bit from the initial and then the mid-lane PAP.
Now, every bowler is going to be a little different, and your layouts and how you throw the ball is going to be different. Some bowlers, you're going to find this PAP migrate towards the center of the grip. You're going to see other ones are going to migrate towards the thumb. You might even see some that actually will hook. It depends on the dynamics of the bowling ball. So once you find it on one ball, it's not going to be the same on all your bowling balls. But the difference between here, the yellow one and this one, this is what it was doing during the hook phase going into the roll phase. It had a lot more flaring, a lot more migration, a lot more friction. So Brian's a higher rev player. Going to have a lot more response on the back end as opposed to what he had in the front end lane. Now, what if we had a player that they were equal here? Would we expect to see as much on the back end?
Yeah, generally that means the ball's not revving up quite as fast, the ball's not flaring as much, so you're not going to see as much change of motion down lane.
So this would definitely relate to change of motion going down lane. Now let's put it all together of our lead bowler, Caroline Doorn-Ballard. Caroline's initial PAP shows us that she has about 15 degrees of tilt and 73 degrees of rotation at release. When we add the second piece of tape and we slow it down, you can see the yellow piece of tape go solid for a very short period of time as the ball is exiting the oil pattern and prepares to come out of the hook phase. Now we want to go to the final PAP at the pins. We're going to change the angle a bit so you can see the third piece of tape. It will be on the side of the ball, and as you can see, it barely gets solid right at the pins, which means the ball didn't quite get into roll before it hit the pins, causing the ball to deflect and not drive through the pins the way we like to see it. Now we've seen some shots and looking at what the ball's doing on the back end for that last roll access point. A good trick that we try to do here at the ITRC is to help bowlers identify it was we put what we call a roll tape. We're going to put it on the side so the bowler can actually see what the ball is doing going through the pins. So we have this line. What was this line again, Brian?
This was the last flare ring that we could see on the bowling ball once it was out of the oil and all the way down the lane. So really from that point, which we already marked right there, we're just going to take a piece of white tape, very similar to all the different tape that we have, and just basically put it right over the top of it. Now from this spot, all things created equal, as the ball is rolling down the lane, we want to see this tape be as much end over end as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that the ball is in the roll phase, but if we see that ball going end over end and not really trying to migrate any more than that, we know where our ball is getting into the roll phase.
And you want to make sure when you do this and avoid, you want to follow it closer to the initial PAP, and you want to avoid what we actually call the bow ties. And the bow ties, you'll find an area up on the top of the bowling ball where all your oil lines kind of cross. There'll be another one down here on the bottom, 180 degrees. So this is what we call the safe zone. And this is where we want to put that tape in that safe zone. So it only rolls across it on the very last revolution. Now let's take a look at some ball motion going through the pins. When the ball's in a row, it's going to contact the head pin, drive through, contact the left side of the 3 pin, driving the 3 into the 6 and the 6 into the 10. You notice the ball rolling off the deck is rolling straight off the center of the pin deck, driving through the pins. This is the ball motion that we're striving to get, or a ball in a row going through the pins. It contacts the 1, 3 and drives through the pins. Now let's take a look at a ball that comes in and it hits the head pin and it deflects. You can see it slightly driving to the right, hitting more of the face of the 3 pin. 3 pin now is going to hit the inside of the 6 and the 6 around the 10 pin. The difference between these two balls is one was driving, it was actually in a row going through the pins, the other one was still slightly in the hook phase. It was in the hook phase getting close to the roll phase, but it didn't drive through the pins. By watching your ball go through the pins will give you an indication of whether your ball's in a roll. Now let's take a look at one of the true taps in bowling. As the ball enters the pocket and drives through that solid 8 pin. But as you notice, as the ball hits the head pin, it is going to contact the 2 and the head pin is going to hit the base of the 5 before the ball gets there, sending the 5 slightly to the right and back off the pin deck. Without another pin to take out the 8, the ball will drive right past the 8 pin. The ball is in a roll, but without the 5 pin to take out the 8, we have the true tap in bowling. Ball motion and lane play. The two go hand in hand, but without understanding one, you can't really apply it to the other. So behind us, we have some bowling balls. And can you explain what we got here, Kim?
Yeah, well, we're sort of representing the 3 phases of ball motion. So we have skid, hook, and roll. And the yellow balls represent the skid phase, the green balls represent the hook phase, and then the all-important roll phase down at the end are the purple balls.
So you always hear these terms matching up, but without understanding the phases that a bowling ball goes through, the skid, hook, and roll, that is just kind of a luck thing. With they say matching up.
Right. We almost sort of just happen upon it, and you know, nowadays I think the better players in the world have really figured out how to match themselves up to what they're seeing and understand the tools that in their game that can kind of better suit the correct ball motion to strike the most.
So I think that's a key. Instead of, you know, they just matched up, they are matching up because they can understand the different phases, the skid, the hook, and the roll, the phases a ball needs to go through down the lane to actually play the lanes and be able to score. We have the yellow bowling balls here representing the skid phase, which is the initial or the first phase a bowling ball goes through in its motion down through the pins.
Right, and this is when the ball's traveling its fastest. It's also the time period where the bowling ball will be at its highest rotation.
Okay, so it's going to be, if you have on the side of the ball, that's the maximum it's going to have as far as side rotation, and it's going to have the maximum speed.
Maximum speed.
And those RPMs is going to have a lot or the
Actually, the lowest amount of RPMs happen in this phase of the bowling motion.
So as it goes down a lane, this is when it's traveling the fastest, retains its axis rotation, but it has only the RPMs that the bowler released it.
Right.
And as we move down, this orange ball represents here just after about 17, 18 feet. This is the transition area between the hook and skid phase.
Right, just really right past the arrow distance.
Yeah, this is the transition zone. I mean, it's not an absolute. It's not goes from skid, boom, immediately to hook. It's going to be a blending. It just kind of flows in starting to the hook phase. So that's represented here by the orange ball, just barely past the arrows. And now we go down here to the green section, which represents the hook phase.
It's much longer than I would have thought, but this is when typically we expect it when we think of hook phase. A lot of times I think most people look for the ball to change direction laterally, and that's not, obviously that's not really the case. That's not when that's happening. It's happening much sooner than that.
Yeah, the ideal ball motion you want to see the ball starting in its hook phase just a little bit past the arrows. Even though the ball's still going in a linear direction or a straight line, it started losing its axis rotation. The ball is starting to slow down, but the RPMs are starting to increase.
Okay, so increase in RPMs when this starts to show up, and then that red ball is indicating when the ball has gotten to its break point?
Yeah, this is going to be representing the break point, and the break point is generally the farthest away from the pocket the ball is going to be. So the ball actually is changing direction, actually going straight down the lane now. So it was going away from the pocket earlier in the skid phase, start of the hook phase, and now it's starting to change direction and come back towards the head point.
Okay, so break point, but when the ball's reached its furthest point for a right-hander, right on the lane, and for a left-hander as far left as it's going to be before it starts to change direction back towards the pocket.
Yes, and this is when you actually lane play, this is the point we want to be concerned with. That rule of 31, you're taking the pattern lane, subtracting 31, kind of gives you an idea where you want to be playing lane. That applies down here to the break point. So a lot of times bowlers get tied up what's going on with the arrows, when we really want to be looking at the break point and how, for my style, can I get the ball to that spot?
To that spot for your style. So sometimes if you're a straighter player, it's going to be more direct, and a more aggressive player, the higher rev rate, further inside.
Further inside, but they're going to still be feeding or sending the ball to the same spot. And it's about 2/3 of the way into the hook phase. I mean, you notice here on the green, we have only twice as many as we have past the break point. So bowlers will see this break point, think that's where the hook phase starts. And if your hook phase starts here, we're in trouble.
Right, because then the skid phase has been far too long.
Way too long. And as you continue down and we go into the hook phase, we go into another transition. And that transition is going to be going from the hook phase to the roll phase. And again, it's not an absolute. It's going to be kind of a blending as it loses its axis rotation. The ball still is slowing down, and those RPMs are still going up.
So the ball speed is at its lowest at this point.
It's slowed down, but it's actually now traveling end over end, or it's in a roll. Perspective from the foul line, it looks like the ball's still going from right to left, but it really is going in a straight line now, going into the pins.
I would think most people would prefer to see their ball sort of change direction, kind of going into the pocket this way in a much more lateral motion, and you're saying it should be more end over end and almost direct, in a direct line as it enters the pocket.
Yes, it's going in a straight line in the roll phase, but if we went 2 lanes or 3 lanes over and looked at that spot, it would be a straight line going away from us. But from the bowler's perspective, from the foul line, it still looks like it's going sideways. So the misconception a lot of time, whether a ball gets in a roll or not, perspective of the bowler, contributes to the issue of not knowing whether it did get into a roll or not. Let's take a look at the different phases from a few different angles, starting with the view we're all familiar with. Here's Brian regular shot, and as you can see, the ball goes through all the phases, and if you take a look, you can really see it all happen. Starting at the release, the ball is immediately into the skid phase. Now, let's take a look at the revolutions, not rotations. So it's how many times the ball goes or rotates around. As you can see, the first few revolutions look like they're happening really fast. But if we go up above, you'll see the ball is actually covering a full 15 feet to make just 2.5 revolutions. From the bowler's view, it looks like it's turning pretty fast. But the truth is, this is the phase where the ball actually has the least RPMs and is traveling the fastest. Now let's go back to the original shot and watch the ball as it's coming out of the arrow as it starts the hook phase. We're concentrating on the area between 15 and 30 feet down the lane. When we go to the overhead view and look at the revolutions, let's count them again. The ball makes 3 revolutions in that second 15 feet. It's gained a half of a revolution, from 2.5 in the first 15 feet to 3 over the next 15 feet. Now it's actually got more RPMs than it did at the start. Back to the beginning, and we're watching the mid lane where the hook phase is in full effect, and we're getting to the break point. You'll see the ball really change direction here, and a lot of bowlers think that's the start of the hook phase, but we're really just entering the last third of the hook phase. Let's go overhead and count the revolutions. The RPMs are going to go up as the speed is coming down. From 30 to 45 feet, the ball makes 3.5 revolutions. Now it's gained a full revolution more than head off its hand, and things are going to start to get interesting. After 45 feet, when the hook phase is going to be ending, and the ball hopefully is going to be entering the roll phase going into the pins. This is where the long piece of tape makes it easier for us to count and see. Count along with how many revolutions it makes those final 15 feet. That's right, the ball makes 5 revolutions on that final 15 feet. That's double the RPMs or revs as the ball head off his hand, and the ball has slowed down and started to go into the roll. When a ball gets into a true roll phase, going into pins, it will drive straight through the pins, hitting the 1, 3, 5, and 9. And this is what we're looking for to get that perfect strike, or the ball to do the right thing through the pins. So let's take it all back from the top. The ball starts going the fastest it will ever go, and the lowest RPM in the skid phase are right off the bowler's hand. In the hook phase, the ball starts to slow down as the revolutions start to increase, and this is where the ball will also loses rotation. As it comes out of the hook phase and goes in the roll phase, we're going to see the ball change in direction and slow down quite a bit as the RPMs increase. Knowing and understanding these phases is the key to matching up. You want to get that ball into a roll as it goes into the pins. The entry angle into the pins. A lot of times we hear bowlers trying to achieve the optimum, they think, entry angle, trying to get more revs and get the ball more angular on the back end.
Right, and I would think it's far more important that the ball's going through the right phase as it enters the pins, that's what's going to give you better chances of striking. So
they did run a study, USB did an entry angle study based on a lot of stagnant parameters about seeing entry angle and offset, and it was true that 6 degrees actually strikes more based on that study, but in the real world, we need more phase. We need that ball rolling going through the pins as opposed to trying to create the most entry angle, because getting that 6 degrees is pretty tough.
Yeah, I mean, it looks cool. I mean, definitely, you know, you get to see a big change of direction down lane, but very difficult to get.
How many players do you think in the world now that are active competing could actually achieve that 6 degrees?
I would think some of the two-handers and some of the really high rev players can do it, but the average person, unlikely.
Okay, so let's take a look at some different styles, different entry angles, and let you see the perspective from the front and the back. Be able to see that a ball that looks like it's very angular, really at the pins isn't that angular at all. Okay, first up we have Teresa. And Teresa's one of the straighter players that we're demonstrating on this entry angle.
Right, lower speed, lower rev rate.
But she can still strike, and it's all about making sure that the ball is into the right phase. It's not going to be generating that huge entry angle. In fact, her style is going to be very tough to do that.
Right, with her hand action and the amount of hook that she'll be able to ever generate, it's never most likely going to get to 6 degrees.
Wouldn't be good for her at all.
But she can strike.
Yes, she can.
Steven, a little bit more of our mid-range player, medium rev rate, a little bit on the softer speed, I would say, for the most part, but good rev rate. He's going to create much bigger entry angle than Teresa can on a regular basis.
Still going to have a hard time getting up to that magical 6 degrees. Again, he's going to be, an important part we want is to get that ball finishing through the pins driving. And last we have Brian. Now Brian is our larger hook player, higher rev player. And you can see he's trying to create as much angle as he can on this shot. But let's take a look at the back. You can actually see that even from this end, from the back view, it looks like it's hooking a lot. But from the pin view, that ball's still going pretty straight down at the pins.
Brian is, of the three that we have, the one that's most likely to be able to get that 6 degrees of entry angle.
Bowlscore was developed back in Wisconsin when USBC was headquartered in Wisconsin. It was used to, because we needed a laboratory way to test the scoreability of pins. Bowlscore is an automatic pin setter or pin spotter that has a ramp that rolls balls over and over and over into it. There's a carriage that carries the ball up to the top of the ramp, and then the ball rolls down the ramp into the pins. The pin setter will reset the pins, and then after that, the ball will cycle back through again and again. The ramp itself moves from 0 to 10 degrees in angular motion away from the head pin and 0 to 5.5 inches of offset from the head pin. So we'll throw shots at any combination thereof. A typical bowl score run will throw 2,530 shots, and that throws 10 shots at every combination of angle and offset. There's a standard ball that we use in bowl score. It doesn't have any imbalance to it, so it has pretty much a spherical core to it, so it allows it to roll the same way down the ramp regardless of where it's at.
Several years back, the specs department for ABC, which is now USBC, ran a test about entry angle, and that's where all this information came out about higher entry angles, increased pin carry. It was done with the machine called Bowl Score using a bowling ball without a weight block, but it gives us some information about striking capabilities at different entry angles. Here we have 2 degrees, Kim.
Yeah, and with 2 degrees, it never got 100% strikes.
And even at 3 degrees, and finally up to 4 degrees, we finally had one setting that we could actually get to 100% striking of the time.
Right, at 2.5 offset.
Really, the one people were famous, the one for the report, was the 6 degrees of entry angle, because we had a lot of room for 100% strikes. And that's why everyone is always trying to achieve that. But in the real world, what are we really looking for?
That the ball is going through the right phase as it goes through the pins, that it's in the roll phase.
So of all this information about optimum entry angle and being more angular and fancy drillings and everything, bottom line is we just want to make sure the ball gets into a roll.
Right, it has to follow the right transition down lane in order to strike most.
Higher entry angles do increase your pin carry, but you're going to need a little bit more deflection to actually get that strike all the time. One of the hardest things players have to adjust to today is ball motion front to back, whether the ball actually is skidding too much or hooking too early.
Right, and very often it's really tricky to see when you're the player. It's great to have a second set of eyes behind you to help you identify, is this pair, when you go to a new pair, is it too oily? Is it oilier than the pair I came off of? Or is it the fact that it's just kind of burnt up in the front and it just giving us that idea that it's tighter?
Because when we get to different pairs, you're going to have topography issues, you're going to have players that came there before you, so the lane will be a different environment. But the appearance is that sometimes you get there and the ball you're just using isn't hooking now, so what do we do?
Right, we ran into this a lot when we were at World Championships with both our men and our women's team. You know, we'd get to a pair and, you know, it'd be game 4 of the round and it would appear to be much, much oilier than the pairs that we'd come off of. So immediately we'd go to more aggressive balls, and you know, sometimes, and unfortunately, we kind of had gone the wrong way as it turned out, because the ball would underreact even more.
Yes, you would have great eyes back there, great players, and you still can be tricked and fooled. So sometimes you want to actually grab a ball that's less responsive, a little more smoother, less reactive, and give it a shot down there, and it might surprise you what that ball will do.
Right, a lot of times it really is the direction to go, and you have to be willing to you have to be a little bit brave and willing to change some balls and change some things in your game, not just sit there and say, oh my goodness, this pair is different, what do I do, what do I do?
You want to make sure that when you do this, you want to kind of get a ball that's far enough away from the ball that you've been using just to get a good read. It might only take one shot, but instead of moving left and right, you might want to see, is it ball burning up, get a mellower ball, or is it too oily, not hooking soon enough, and get a more aggressive ball. So here we have Steven. He just came over here to lane 8, and he's throwing the same aggressive ball he's been using all day.
Right, and you can see this ball, it got into a roll pretty early, just didn't have a whole lot left when it got down lane. So as a result, he 2-4-10.
Yeah, so he came up light. So now he's going to switch balls, go to a less aggressive ball, and throw that in the same area.
So in throwing a lesser aggressive ball, it's obvious that really what Steven was seeing was not a heavier oiled lane, but simply something that was burned up. And by using the weaker ball, it saved more energy and had much more left when it hit the pocket.
And it was only one shot, but it was really good read for that one shot, and he just sacrificed the one frame just to see. Now he's going to be able to line up with this ball because the ball definitely had more energy on the back end, drove through the pins, even though it went high, instead of wasting time with that ball he's been using all this time and trying to make it work. So as we take a look at the lane that actually was burning up, a lot of players always think their more aggressive ball should hook more all the time.
Right, and that's not at all the case. I mean, usually a more aggressive ball, either a stronger cover or more surface is gonna roll earlier, so you'll see more of a motion in the front part of the lane, not necessarily more in the back part.
So it has a lot of hook potential, but it's where it uses that potential up, and since it's using a lot of its hook potential early, there's not much left on the back end. Brian, here we are at the International Training Research Center, and let's describe the release or the components of a release. Because a ball motion, if you don't understand your release, you don't understand your ball motion. So what are the components that we look at for during a release?
Well, in terms of the variables that we can impart to the bowling ball, we have speed, which is not actually a part of the release, but it's one of the variables we impart. Then we have axis tilt, axis rotation, and RPMs. So those last three are the three main components of the release.
That they can adjust. And we talk about, you know, RPMs, that's how fast the ball is spinning going down the lane, in relationship travel down the lane. But axis tilt and axis rotation, a lot of players or coaches get those two backwards.
Yeah, I think it's the most misunderstood and most confusing part of, you know, the release in general, because lots of people confuse the two. They consider axis rotation actually axis tilt.
So we got a bowling ball down here on the lane, and we have an axis or the axle going across with these two rods. And bowling ball in this position would be called 0 degrees of tilt and 0 degrees of rotation.
Yeah, so the more we start to move this rod just along the horizontal plane or more along the equator of the bowling ball, we're actually changing rotation.
Okay, so this is going to give us rotation. So the more I'm on, like at this point here on the side of the ball, we would call this 90 degrees. So the ball is spinning 90 degrees to the direction it's traveling. Is this going to make the ball hook more?
It's going to make it hook more when it encounters friction. So we're going to see a definite increase in skid of the bowling ball, but then we're going to see more change of direction when it encounters friction.
So this is going to give me maximum skid with the potential for maximum hook, like a Pete Weber. But it needs to have friction. So if this is on oily lanes, we don't want to be here.
No, definitely not. The ball's never going to have a chance to read the lane. It's pretty much going to go through the back of the building.
Okay, and if we come back over to our 0, now tilt is going to be coming this direction.
Exactly. So we talked about it being on the equator of the bowling ball in terms of rotation. Well, now if we imagine this still being like the globe, so to speak, if we start to come more towards the North Pole and we start to have this PAP come up to the North Pole, that's where we're going to start to notice the increase in tilt.
So as we increase tilt, are we increasing hook?
No, we're still going to increase the length, but we're not going to see the real change of direction down lane.
So as a player's tilt goes up, that increases the skid phase of the bowling ball, but you take away a little bit of the back end reaction. A good example would be like a helicopter, the ones we see in Thailand and stuff. I mean, they are maximum tilt because they're spinning the ball like this. So very good, a lot of skid, no back end reaction at all.
Yeah, when the lanes are really, really dry, you'll see people that have a lot more tilt have a lot more success.
So we have two lines here drawn, and this would be like two different types of releases. And so we have a bowler, which would be used to call it a high 3/4, and we have another bowler here that's going to be more of a little bit of a spinner. What's the difference between these two, and why do they track there?
Well, the one that's generally going to be closer to the fingers and thumbs, not necessarily always the case, but that's generally going to be a sign of less tilt. And what that means is for each rotation of the bowling ball, each rotation that we make on this bowling ball, we're actually covering a larger circumference of the bowling ball.
So even though it was 1 RPM or 1 revolution, this actually traveled a bigger distance than this one here.
Let's take a standard bowling pin. We're going to mark a spot towards the belly of the pin, and then we'll mark a spot towards the top part of the pin. As you can see, when the bowling pin makes 1 complete revolution, those 2 marks are always going to come back at the exact same time. But if you think about it in terms of the mathematics, because the wider part or the belly of the pin is actually covering more distance in that 1 revolution, that mark is actually traveling at a faster rate of speed than the mark towards the top part of the pin. Regardless if we spin it faster or if we spin it slower, they always come back at the same time. So that's how the release ratio and the track circumference plays into bowling, is that the more track circumference we're covering, we're actually going to be traveling at a faster rate of speed to make that 1 complete revolution.
So the part of the bowling ball that is touching the lane, if you have a lower tilt, which means you have a larger track, the part that's touching the lane is actually going to be traveling faster, even though it's the same 1 RPM going down the lane.
Yeah, exactly. Or conversely, if we have a track that's more like a saucer dish, just a small track, it's not going to take as much time for that to go around, so therefore the speed is going to be a little slower.
So we have 2 lines here, and one we have is, this first line is what we call 10 degrees. So 10 degrees is going to be approximately right about like so. So we have rotation, which would be 90, 45, and going to 0. That's going to be 10 degrees of tilt. Now, the 30 degrees of tilt is going to be more about like here. So again, your rotation and you're going to be tilt. We haven't talked about we hear about full rollers. What are the full rollers?
Well, full roller means, in terms of that tilt, is when tilt is at 0 degrees, or we're covering the whole circumference of the bowling ball for each rotation. So 27 inches around the bowling ball for one complete rotation.
Now, it's generally considered that full rollers would be going between their fingers and thumb. Is that always correct?
Yeah, not necessarily. I would say the majority of full rollers generally track in that spot, but we have seen bowlers that cover the full circumference, but both just on the outside of the fingers or the thumb.
So we're really just talking about a full roller is 0 degrees of tilt.
Yep.
And then we have a 3/4, we used to call 3/4, it's going to be about a 10 to 17 degrees of tilt. And then a spinner is going to be maybe the 30 plus degrees of tilt.
Exactly, and you know, everything's based off of this initial PAP, so that's why it's so important to find your PAP, because all these measurements are really based off of that.
And for lane play, we want to be able to control our rotation. Can a bowler change their tilt?
They can, but I would say it's the hardest variable to actually change. So it's not something that we generally suggest. But in terms of rotation, you know, that's more along the lines of what we're going to do to try and match up with the lane and either have it go longer and skid more, or have it roll a little sooner and read the lane a little quicker.
So rotation we can change in competition as the lanes change or adjust or transition, but tilt, that takes time. You can change it, but it's not something that you would change between games or between frames.
Yeah, it's almost like the fingerprint of the bowler's release, not something that many people can change and do consistently.
One of the key components of understanding ball motion for an individual player is what we call the release ratio. And that is going to be the ratio of how fast the ball is traveling down a lane in relationship to how fast the ball is spinning. Just because you have 300 RPM does not mean that your 300 RPM is going to rotate as fast as someone else's 300 RPM based on their tilt. So just to give you an example, when you release the bowling ball, let's take a bowler that's releasing at 21 miles per hour. If they're releasing at 21 miles an hour, and if they had what we call a release ratio of 3 to 1, the ball would actually be spinning at 7 miles per hour. As the ball goes down the lane, it will start losing speed, so it will start dropping. The RPMs, or how fast the ball is spinning, will come up. What we're looking for is that match right there going into the pins. So this right here would be a 3 to 1 ratio, which means the ball is traveling 3 times faster down the lane than it's actually spinning. If the lanes were oily, we would actually want to decrease that ratio for that bowler. Again, the key is that we want to be able to do it down here, the pins at 60 feet. So we would need the ball to actually pick up earlier, because if we had oilier lanes with the same release, these 2 points would never come in together. So we either have to reduce how fast we're throwing it, or we have to increase how fast it's spinning. We have to reduce the ratio. So instead of going to 3.1, we might want to go to 2.5 to 1. That way the ball has a chance to match up going into the pins. And that's what we call the release ratio. Back when I was in the pro shop business, Brian, everyone always wanted to come in and buy a new ball because they wanted to get more RPMs on the ball. They thought there were some secrets to the drillings, anything like that, because RPMs is what everyone wants. What are RPMs?
Well, RPM stand for revolutions per minute, so it's basically how quickly that ball is rotating when it's on the lane.
So it's a measurement of how fast it's revving. They used to call it revs. Back in the day, everyone wanted to get more revs, and now the keyword's RPM. Is there a difference between RPMs and revs?
Well, revs, if you think about it, is just the amount of times that the ball is actually going to sort of turn over as it's going down the lane, which really just depends on how fast you're throwing it. And if you're throwing the ball 10, 11, 12 miles per hour down the lane, it's going to have a lot more time to turn over more times. In terms of RPMs, we're not necessarily based off of how fast it's going down the lane.
So RPMs is a more accurate measurement of what the bowler is imparting to the bowling ball. Revs back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we used to measure revs about how many times it rev going down the lane, how many revolutions it made going down the lane. That's what back when bowling balls were just starting to have some dynamics, everything rolled in the same place, and everything was kind of consistent, and the oil patterns were consistent. Balls started getting a little more dynamic, so they started measuring the first 15 feet and multiplied that by 4. Still not really accurate. So RPMs, what we do to measure RPMs is actually very accurate.
Sure. Now, some people may say, well, you know, the ball's not on the lane that long, so, you know, what do we say about it?
Oh, yeah, we've heard that term that, you know, revolutions per minute, the ball's on the lane for how long? 2.5 seconds, you know, so how can we do RPMs, revolutions per minute? It's the same reason we measure miles per hour. Bowling ball's not on the lane for an hour and we're still measuring. It's an accurate measurement of what the bowling ball's doing. So are all RPMs created equal?
No, that's where we start to talk about the release ratio, because every rotation, depending on your axis tilt or the circumference of the ball that's actually in contact with the lane, it's going to make the revolutions per minute act sort of different.
So bowlers are always worried about my RPMs. They should be more concerned about what their release ratio is, RPMs based on their axis tilt.
Yeah, and match that up together.
Let's go ahead and take a look at Earl and show some of the relationships of different RPMs will do to ball motion. Brian, so we have Earl here, and Earl is going to show us some shots changing the RPMs, but some of the stuff's going to stay the same for this release for Earl.
Yeah, we're going to keep the miles per hour the same, so how fast the ball's traveling down the lane. We're going to keep the tilt the same, so how much track circumference is actually being covered. And then we're going to keep the rotation the same, so how much they're on the side of it versus up the back.
So we have 16 miles an hour is what we're going to be throwing at 16 degrees at tilt. Very normal release for most people, going in rotation 60 degrees. We're going to be a little bit more on the side of the ball than most people, but it's a good average place to start. So we're going to start at 200 RPMs. What type of player would be around 200 RPMs?
I would say a more down and in type player, more stroker type player, someone that's generally not going to have too much change of direction overall.
So it's going to be more where we might see some players that just don't have a lot of hand. Now we're going to the 325.
Yeah, and then we start to get into a little bit more. You can see with the change of ball motion, you can see that the ball has a lot more ability to sort of change directions once it gets down lane.
Now we're 450. Now we're into the Tommy Jones, the Sean Rash categories. This one, when we're talking about even ratio, they need some more speed.
Yeah, you can see at 16 miles per hour, it's not quite going fast enough down the lane for that ball, and just on the pattern that they're bowling on, the ball's going to really hook across the lane quite heavily.
Now we did 575. That's when we get into the realm of the two-handers.
Yeah, so if you're looking at Jason Belmonte, Oscar Palermo, any of the two-handed players out there with 575 to almost more, 600 RPM, 16 miles per hour isn't going to cut it.
They definitely got to be throwing at 21, 22 miles an hour. So getting back to the ratio, for the lower RPMs, you need slower speed. Higher RPMs, you need more speed to be able to get matchup.
Exactly.
So all lanes aren't created equally, and we have different surfaces, wood, synthetic, all of them can create different ball reactions. And Emily I have here is our research engineer here at the USBC, and she's going to explain a little bit of the differences in color, surface, hardness, all of those things that make your ball roll a little bit different.
Here at the United States Bowling Congress, we try to test all different aspects of the game. And one of those, and one of the main important ones, are bowling lanes. And so what we test on the bowling lanes are hardness on the surface and the impact hardness, with two different utensils. When the ball touches the lane, it creates a footprint, and this footprint is the amount of surface that is actually touching the lane. So when you think of it, you think of the bowling ball's touching the lane in just one particular part, but it's not, depending on the surface of the lane. Wood surfaces are softer in hardness.
So this is a wood lane
This is a
here?
wood surface, yes.
Okay.
It is softer, and so when the ball is touching it, when that amount of weight, your 15, your 14-pound ball is sitting on it, then it actually indents in the wood a little bit. And we're thinking, when you think indentation, you're thinking extremes. But no, this is a very little bit, but that little bit matters. Because
it creates friction?
Yes, because
Okay.
the more surface that is touching the lane, the more friction that has the ability to create. So a synthetic lane, with it not being as soft, it's a lot harder of a surface.
Okay.
It creates a lot less of a footprint, and therefore a lot less friction.
And friction means hook.
Yes, friction
us.
means hook to a bowler. So that's why wood lanes would hook a lot more than your synthetic lanes.
Okay. And there's different types of synthetics? There's,
Yes.
So in difference in color, obviously, we have three
Obviously,
different
yeah,
ones.
you can see that all these different lanes are drastically different in color. And this is all on the manufacturing themselves, how they would like the lane to look. I mean, this lane here actually looks a little bit closer to your wood lane, what you would see in past houses. These are a little bit more modern. These are actually the same lane, just a different color. And so each house has the ability to choose what they want in their bowling alley.
So if there's more friction, and when you're talking about kind of the indentation the ball makes, it creates more hook for a bowler. So when we have less friction, we get more skid throughout the lane. So a pattern will play very differently on one of the softer synthetics, let's just say, than the harder synthetic.
Exactly. Because I mean, even if you, okay, so you have the same oil pattern down on your wood lane, you have the same oil pattern down on your synthetic lane. The amount of friction that's created here dictates how much the ball is going to hook. So it will hook less, even though the same amount of oil is here, it will hook less because there's a lot less friction created, a lot less energy in that ball.
Now, how do you measure this?
We use actually two different tools. We do one that is a surface tension, that is your surface hardness, and this is where we use what we call a sword hardness rocker. It actually is a sword hardness rocker, so it rocks back and forth. And what you do is you calibrate it using this, obviously on an even surface. But when you test, what it's testing is the dampening of the angle, which means if I started at a 45-degree angle, how quickly does that angle from 45 degrees where it's starting go down towards 15?
Okay.
And it's how quickly that happens. So it's counting the amount of rocks. And so a softer surface is going to create less rocks because it is more containing that rocking motion.
Okay.
Rather than a harder surface allows the motion to go more evenly. So it takes longer for it to decrease in angle.
So if you were to put this on the wood lane,
it would take a lot shorter time than it does on a synthetic lane.
Okay, cool.
All right. Our second type of hardness, what we do, is called an impact hardness. And we use a hand durometer. And what it is a needle at the bottom and with a hand held here. So when you turn it on, and we do it for 2 seconds. We allow it to impact the surface for 2 seconds, getting the highest reading possible. And so you basically set it on the surface and you allow it and it will beep at you when it is 2 seconds. And the same thing goes from here as it does here for correlation as hardness. You will find a shorter or smaller number here because it is softer surface, and you will find a harder number here.
So is a bowling center required to test this daily? I mean, how often is this tested?
Bowling centers are not required. This is on a manufacturing basis. So when a manufacturer comes out with a new panel, what they will do is they will submit it to me. There's an application online. They will submit it to me, and at that point, I will get the panels, and I will test for sword hardness. I will test durometer, as well as many other factors.
Does temperature affect the hardness at all?
Yes. I mean, it's like it's in a bowling alley. You know, you go in, it's a little humid, things happen a little differently. Temperature is a big factor as far as, I mean, it's water absorbency. It's what humidity is. So for a wood lane, it definitely gets affected at a higher rate than a synthetic panel.
So if you're testing, say, early in the morning, and then, you know, as sun comes up, it gets much warmer, the lane could test a little softer later in the day, so your ball's going to react a little bit
Exactly.
differently.
When we test, we test at a standard 72 degrees, a standard humidity. But for any bowling alley, yes, if you go out there and you test, you can test in the morning, you can test in the late afternoon, and you could, in theory, get different answers.
So Emily, how does a bowling ball fall into the scheme of things in terms of hardness?
Well, actually, that's a very good question. A bowling ball's hardness, our minimum spec is 72. And so what we actually can find is that the bowling ball is actually harder than a wood surface, but softer than a synthetic.